Phainon's rerun banner is right around the corner, and there is a surprising amount of things that have changed since Phainon's last rerun, as well as several things I just want to reiterate and emphasize for anyone considering investing into Phainon. Should you even invest into Phainon? And if so, what's the new best path of investment for Phainon and his teams? We're going to talk about all things you need to know to decide if and how you should invest into Phainon on his coming rerun banner. I'm going to assume most people watching this video already have a basic understanding of how Phainon's kit works, so we're just going to jump into the main topic, starting with the most basic question. Should you even bother with Phainon's rerun banner? In general, with Honkai Star Rail, it's pretty risky to pull any DPS characters on their rerun banners because newer characters tend to be the safer investments due to getting new teammates and having the endgame environment tailored towards them. For this reason, the most I generally recommend for anybody who wants to invest in an older DPS character is to only consider it if they're on their first rerun. But by the time a DPS gets their second rerun, like Phainon, you should probably just be investing in the newer DPS characters instead of an old DPS character who is no longer being shilled. However, Phainon is an exception to this rule to some degree. The reason I would say Phainon is an exception is because of how hard he scales with his E2. If you are already invested enough in your Phainon, getting him to that massive E2 breakpoint could be a better use of your pulls than investing elsewhere. And that's why Phainon's rerun banner can still be a consideration for some players. However, there are a few rules I would recommend sticking to when it comes to the question of whether or not you should invest in Phainon. The first rule of thumb: only invest in Phainon if you're investing fully into his E2. Phainon is a massive E2 merchant, and he relies heavily on his E2 to keep up with the more meta teams. Just to briefly touch on Phainon's E2 reliance, the strength of Phainon's E2 is not necessarily a strictly bad thing. While other characters rely heavily on horizontal investment, aka investing into other teammates in order to enable their maximum strength, Phainon relies mainly on his own personal vertical investment. It really is not all that different from a character like Casterus wanting the full mono remembrance team, except in Phainon's case, you unlock his full potential by investing more into Phainon himself instead of any teammates. That's not to say he doesn't have teammate investment options, but we'll cover that later. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that people often point to Phainon's E2 reliance as a negative, but in the current state of Honkai Star Rail's meta, I don't think it's as damning as people make it out to be in comparison to the investment other teams also require. On top of that, you would much rather have a character be an E2 merchant as opposed to a character having very underwhelming vertical investments that feel bad to even get. Case in point, Anaxa. This character shined throughout the entirety of Amphorius for being good at low cost, but Anaxa's own Eidolons feel so awful and not worth it. And I think I speak for all Anaxa mains when I say that I would have given anything for Anaxa to have a Phainon level E2 so that I could justify investing further into my Anaxa. All this to say, yes, Phainon is an E2 merchant who heavily relies on his E2 in order to perform up to par, but this is not necessarily a point of slander, and I just wanted to clarify that because of how the conversation around Phainon's E2 often feels in the community. So, with all of that said, you should never pull for E0 Phainon if you care about clearing content in any way. It's the harsh truth, but if you're looking to invest into only one single copy of Phainon, turn back now. You will get a much better return on investment by focusing on one of the more modern DPS teams. The general rule I would use when deciding if the Phainon rerun banner is right for you is something we'll be calling the 2/4 rule. There are 2 out of 4 different investments you need to already have on your account in order for me to recommend Phainon's rerun banner for you. If you do not have 2 out of 4 of these things, you should probably just not invest into Phainon and invest your pulls elsewhere. So, one copy of Phainon himself is the obvious first thing. If you don't own Phainon already, I would genuinely recommend probably saving your pulls, unless you're still willing to go all the way for his E2. After Phainon himself, there is his Light Cone, which is a massive increase for Phainon, despite the fact that his free-to-play option on the Fall of an Aeon isn't bad by any means. His Light Cone is just really nuts for him, giving him defense shred, damage bonus, and the very valuable base speed to speed up his turns within his ultimate. The next thing on the list is Phainon's E1, which seems like a no-brainer. If you have Phainon's E1 already, going for his E2 next seems obvious, given that that's the really big breakpoint, but I figured I had to mention it anyway. And lastly, the fourth thing on the list is none other than Cyrene. Cyrene needs no introduction as Phainon's best in slot support at this point. So here is how the 2 out of 4 rule applies to the Phainon rerun banner. If you have any combo of 2 things out of this list of 4 investments, then Phainon's E2 is a pretty good pull for your account. So for example, if you already have Phainon E0 and his S1, then taking him to E2 is a decent idea. If your Phainon is E0 with no S1, but you do have Cyrene, then taking Phainon to E2 is once again a fairly decent idea. Obviously, getting his Light Cone as well would be ideal, but Phainon's E2 should always be the priority. And if you can't get Phainon's E2, then again, I just wouldn't consider his rerun banner at all. And then, of course, if your Phainon is E1, getting the E2 is also pretty safe. However, even if you meet the 2 out of 4 rule, I still don't think it's set in stone that you should invest all the way for the E2 Phainon. It's more so a case where if you meet the 2 out of 4 rule, then the Phainon rerun banner is a consideration for you, but definitely not something you need to go for when you could still instead invest your pulls into a different team, although you would essentially be ditching your Phainon team. If you don't meet the 2 out of 4 rule, then you should never consider Phainon's rerun banner, and he'll probably just have to stay on the bench. The only time I would say the Phainon rerun banner is something I would recommend much more strongly is if you reach the 3 out of 4 threshold. So say you have Phainon, E0, S1, and Saridra, which is probably a situation that a decent amount of people find themselves in. If this is you, investing in Phainon's E2 is a pretty safe option for you. However, even at the 3 out of 4 threshold, I would still say it's only something I recommend if you specifically want to keep playing your Phainon. Even with an E0 S1 Phainon with his best support Saridra, I still think you're perfectly safe putting this team on the back burner and instead investing your pulls into more modern DPS units. Phainon's rerun banner is basically never going to be a must pull, no matter how close you are to completing the Phainon Exodia of getting his E2, simply because that is the nature of a DPS character who is on their second rerun. They're a pretty low priority character that I only highly recommend to people who just really love that character. So again, just think about which investments you already have for Phainon's team from the list, and decide if you're already invested enough to consider investing even further on his rerun banner. If your current Phainon team investment is too low, I would consider investing into a different team. But of course, given how powerful Phainon's E2 is, and given that he's already had a rerun before this, there are a decent amount of people who probably already have Phainon's E2, right? If that's the case, then you obviously already have Phainon's most important investment. There's no need to invest in Phainon past his E2 plus his signature Lycone, but if you do want to invest even further into Phainon just because you love him, then, well, things get a little bit interesting. First off, there's his teammates to talk about. Once you get Phainon to E2 S1, you should consider the amount of investment in his teammates, and there are a few main ones to talk about. We've already mentioned Saridra, who you should always get for Phainon, but aside from her, Phainon teams have recently gone through a big change with the introduction of Sparkle's Nova Flare. In general, Phainon teams are split up into 2 different categories, Cyrene teams and Sparkle teams. These are the 2 main ways to play Phainon, with the assumption being that Saridra is always on the team as well. So, what are the benefits of each team? The main benefit to Cyrene teams is how powerful it is in longer fights, such as in Anomaly Arbitration. Cyrene makes it so Phainon no longer exits his ultimate, meaning stacking core flames is no longer an issue. So, whereas with other teams, you would need to eat up quite a bit of action value in between every Phainon ultimate every time he exits it, Cyrene makes this a complete non-issue. The other benefit is sustainability. While Cyrene does drain Phainon's HP inside of his ultimate, as long as you can manage this, which generally isn't too difficult with Phainon's own self-healing, Cyrene teams are much safer. The biggest risk when playing Phainon sustainless is the risk of his other supports dying every time he exits his ultimate, and the supports are forced to face tank the enemy while trying to stack his core flames to get him back into his ultimate. Since Cyrene fixes this by making sure the rest of the team never has to come back on the field and take any hits, she keeps the rest of the team alive at the expense of making survival slightly more difficult on Phainon. But generally, Phainon will be alright, and there are ways of ensuring a second Phainon ultimate with Cyrene if Phainon does end up dying, such as saving one of Cyrene's ultimate usages if you know your Phainon is going into a fight where he will die. The last pro to Cyrene teams is her E2. Cyrene's E2 is incredibly powerful for Phainon, generally allowing her to give him his ultimate within the first 20 action value of a battle, and then letting Phainon remain in his ultimate for the entire rest of the fight. E2 Cyrene is the biggest action value saver for Phainon teams. Not to mention her E1's recollection stack refund for herself adds an extra safety net by providing Cyrene an extra ultimate to use on Phainon in case he ends up dying inside of his ultimate, like we mentioned earlier. At E2, Cyrene is easily Phainon's best teammate, alongside Saridra. At E0, Cyrene's benefits mainly come in the form of comfort, saving your Phainon lots of action value in between ultimates, while keeping the rest of your team safe. A lot of people will probably mention that Cyrene takes a long time to activate her ultimate at E0, but no, she doesn't. A well-built Cyrene team with proper rotations will activate Cyrene's ultimate, and thus Phainon's ultimate, in roughly the exact same amount of time as a non-Cyrene team. If you need more insight into how to properly build and play the Phainon Cyrene rotation, please watch this video of mine. It does require Remembrance Trailblazer, so that is one con if your RMC is currently busy elsewhere. Additionally, the Cyrene rotation does get hurt a lot by any Anomaly Arbitration debuffs that cause the team to start the fight with less energy. On top of this, Anomaly Arbitration has recently been targeting the Phainon Cyrene duo with a specific debuff that makes your characters do less damage unless they activate their ultimate 2 times to get rid of the debuff. Since Phainon never gets to use his ultimate 2 times in a Cyrene team, he can't get rid of the debuff without some fringe strategies. So unfortunately, the Phainon Cyrene team has been underperforming lately due to this specific Anomaly Arbitration debuff targeting them. Now then, what about the benefits to the Sparkle version of Phainon teams? Well, first off, Sparkle is essentially a free character since she's on the free 5-star selector. Make sure you don't forget to use the free 5-star selector before it goes away, by the way. Anyway, Sparkle is essentially free, and after her Nova Flare, she has some of the strongest damage amplification in the entire game. Her buffs are so powerful, in fact, that you will easily see your Phainon hitting much larger numbers with Sparkle compared to with Cyrene. However, due to Cyrene giving Phainon an infinite ultimate compared to Sparkle, who needs to eat up a lot of action value every time Phainon exits his ultimate, Cyrene is able to make up for her lower buffs and catch up to Sparkle's damage in longer fights. Essentially, Cyrene is the best option for Phainon in longer fights, assuming the Anomaly Arbitration debuff isn't specifically targeting her, whereas Sparkle is much stronger for Phainon in shorter fights. If you only need one Phainon ultimate in order to clear, Sparkle is especially much stronger than an E0 Cyrene for Phainon's damage. However, Sparkle of course brings with her all of the issues that Cyrene fixes. The longer a fight goes on, the more dangerous it becomes for Phainon's teammates, since they'll be forced to face tank attacks from the enemy. There are many scenarios where this isn't too big of an issue, and even more scenarios where you can pray to enemy RNG that they don't attack the wrong characters. But in some scenarios, you probably will just die, depending on the enemy and depending on how many times you have to cycle through Phainon's ultimates. It's really just matchup dependent. The other benefit is that the last slot in Sparkle's team is a little bit more flexible compared to Cyrene's team, which requires RMC to work. Unless Cyrene is E2, at which point the last teammate slot becomes much more flexible. RMC is still generally one of the best last slots for Sparkle teams, especially in terms of cost effectiveness, but it is technically more flexible in case you need RMC somewhere else, and you can use the likes of Bronya or Sunday for core flame stacks. Sunday has been getting a lot of rumors of an upcoming Nova Flare, so that could change things even more and swing things heavily in favor of the Sunday Sparkle team for Phainon. We'll have to wait and see and cover that whenever the supposed Sunday Nova Flare does come out, so keep your eyes out for that. Unfortunately, Sunday is not the most recommended teammate for Phainon like he used to be, but we'll see if that changes. So this is how the two teams compare. Essentially, Cyrene is the best for longer fights, whereas Sparkle is the best for shorter fights. If you vertically invest into Cyrene, however, she just becomes the best Phainon support in general, while also bringing a lot of safety nets for Phainon and the rest of the team. But how does this relate to Ceridra's vertical investment? Essentially, Ceridra's E1 gains a lot of value outside of Cyrene teams due to the extra core flame stack generation from her E1's energy. Inside of Cyrene teams, Ceridra's E1 isn't as valuable, but the defense strat is still very nice. However, the main investment in Cyrene teams is still Cyrene's own E2. If you're playing a Sparkle team instead of a Cyrene team, Ceridra's E1 becomes much more relevant, occasionally even allowing you to slot in a stronger support who doesn't give any core flame stacks, like Tribby or Mortonax Blade, who we will touch upon more in a second. So, in terms of investing in a Phainon team, after you've gotten Phainon's E2 S1, the next thing to consider is which path you're going to take for his team. Cyrene is rerunning alongside Phainon, but in general, I would only pull Cyrene specifically for Phainon if you plan on going all the way for Cyrene's E2. Do note, this wasn't the exact advice I gave when Cyrene first released, but due to the introduction of Sparkle as a free powerful unit for Phainon, I would now mainly only recommend pulling Cyrene for Phainon if you're willing to take the team to higher investment. If you already have Cyrene for Phainon, the team is still fine, of course. Essentially, if you aren't planning on investing that much further into Phainon's teammates after taking Phainon himself to E2 S1, then just stick with the Sparkle version of the team, in which case, Ceridra's E1 gains a lot of value as the next team investment. However, if you are comfortable pulling several more 5-stars to upgrade your Phainon past E2 S1, then E2 Cyrene is easily the best next investment. It really just depends on how far you're looking to invest. Now, no matter which route you decide to take, both E1 Ceridra and E2 Cyrene have the added benefit of allowing you to slot in basically any character in the last slot of the team. So, who should you use in that last slot? The best general damage amplifiers you can use are Tribby and Mortonax Blade, especially if they're at E1. Tribby has the added benefit of being a Crisis Heir for Cyrene teams, meaning she does save you quite a bit of action value. Otherwise, Cyrene will take a bit longer to get her ultimate, even with her E2, if you're using Mortonax Blade. You can also combine the two team paths by using Sparkle with Cyrene if Cyrene is E2, but this is generally only really worth it over Tribby when Sparkle is also E2. So, let's look at the path to investment for the different Phainon teams. Here is the baseline Phainon team, running the Sparkle version, since this is the cheaper, beginner version of a Phainon team with Ceridra and RMC. In this team, just build Sparkle as fast as possible. Obviously, as we discussed earlier, Sparkle is technically replaceable with Sunday or Bronya for the core flame stack generating slot, but Sparkle is the best in slot, so we're gonna keep referring to it as a Sparkle team. If you're going to play Phainon, the first thing you're gunning for is Phainon's E2 S1. After that, you either go for Ceridra's E1, which is just one extra 5-star, in order to stick with the Sparkle team variant, or you just straight up replace Sparkle with Cyrene by transitioning to the Cyrene E2 team route, which is a lot of extra 5-stars, heroes, but it's technically the strongest version of a Phainon team. If you stick with the Sparkle team and you get Cyredra's E1, you can situationally replace the last slot on the team with Tribby or Blade, especially if they have their E1. But sometimes you'll still find yourself short on core flame stacks if you're using either of these two, even with Cyredra's E1. So RMC is still one of the better options, even if you get Cyredra's E1. Sunday and Bronya can also function as RMC replacements, but these two are nowhere near as important for Phainon nowadays until Sunday gets his eventual Nova Flare, and then we'll see. If you want to invest into this team even further, Sparkle's E2 is very good, but like, if you're going to invest into Sparkle's E2 for Phainon, you might as well just invest into Cyrene's E2 instead and transition to that team, you know? Of course, it's valid if you need your Cyrene in a different team, but since we're focusing mainly on Phainon in this video, let's discuss that E2 Cyrene route. So, you've pulled E2 Cyrene to transition to the Cyrene team, with Cyredra and RMC still on the team. Even though Cyredra's E1 isn't gaining value from the extra core flames, the defense threat is still valuable enough for it to be a priority over any of the support light cones. Additionally, with E2 Cyrene, you can replace RMC with Tribby or Mortonak's Blade. In general, if Tribby is E1, I still found her to be the best simply because she speeds up Cyrene's ultimate thanks to being a Chrysos heir and dealing decent personal damage with Cyrene's buff on her. But Blade is still perfectly fine. If Sparkle is E2, she can also be in this last slot, and there are some shenanigans you can do with using Sparkle to act in advanced Cyrene in order to make up for the fact that Sparkle isn't a Chrysos heir to stack Cyrene's ultimate. So Tribby and Sparkle still feel more comfortable in the last slot of an E2 Cyrene team than Blade, even if Blade is still very strong in his own right. Sparkle E2 versus Tribby E1 versus Blade E1 all performed relatively close to each other in an E2 Cyrene team, and it oftentimes comes down to enemy matchup, with Tribby E1 obviously getting a lot better in full AoE fights. Cyrene and Cyredra's light cones are the last things I would recommend investing into for these two. Cyredra's E2 technically also gives a small buff to Phainon, but it really is not worth the extra 5-star pull. I also recommend Cyrene's light cone more than Cyredra's for this team, just because you can make use out of DDD on Cyredra even in this team. I'll probably release a video going through ideal E2 Cyrene rotations as well, so keep your eyes out for that. Also, Cyrene's light cone banner has the DDD 4-star light cone on it, so it's just a very high value banner in general. As far as Phainon supports go, that's as far as I would recommend investing into them, whether it be the Cyrene team or the Sparkle team or even the combination of them together. These teams are all already very high investment, but if you want to invest even further, then we can start talking about completing your Phainon vertical investment. But here's the thing, Phainon's vertical investment after E2S1 actually isn't as clear cut as you might think. You would think you would just need to take Phainon to E6 and be done with it. Game over. You've made your Phainon as strong as possible. But that actually isn't the case. You see, while Phainon's E6 is certainly strong, a lot of the value of the E6 actually comes from the extra core flames at the start of battle, which gives him a lot of flexibility in being played with teammates who give no core flame stacks, such as the aforementioned Tribby and Blade. However, as we previously discussed, Cyrene completely ignores Phainon's core flame stacking mechanic. This means that a large portion of the utility from Phainon's E6 is actually completely erased by Cyrene, since those extra core flames no longer matter. Technically, the extra core flames translate to a measly bit of extra crit damage from Cyrene's buff, but it's essentially nothing. And as usual, the E3, E4, and E5 are nothing to write home about. Phainon actually has one of the better E4s in the game, but that's not saying much considering how awful most E4s are. This means that the only real benefit you're getting from upgrading Phainon from E2 to E6 in his ideal high investment Cyrene team is the true damage on his meteors from the E6. And while this is very strong, especially since Phainon's E6 works the same way as Tribby's E1, where it redirects the damage to the target with the highest HP, Phainon does a decent amount of damage from his regular stabs and counterattacks. Spamming his counterattack especially becomes a higher portion of his damage in AoE. Obviously, his meteor is still most of his damage, but the fact that Phainon's E6 doesn't buff any of his other attacks outside of his meteor means it's probably not as crazy as you might think. Again, I need to reiterate, obviously it's still very strong, but there's another option for vertically investing into Phainon that offers even more. I am of course talking about Phainon's light cone, more specifically superimposing his light cone to S5 instead of pulling his Eidolons to E6. For most characters, this would never be a consideration, but Phainon is an exception due to how powerful the superimpositions on his light cone are. Superimposing Phainon's light cone is one of the only ways to increase his base speed, so it's one of the only ways to make him take his turns even faster inside of his ultimate. On top of that, defense threat is obviously also a very rare stat, and doubling the amount of defense threat from his light cone by S5ing it is also very valuable. The larger damage percent from the light cone is also really nice, and what makes all of this even better is the fact that all of the damage buffs from superimposing Phainon's light cone will impact all of Phainon's damage, not just his meteors, as opposed to Phainon's E6, which only buffs the meteors. This means an E2 S5 Phainon actually will often outperform an E6 S1 Phainon Phainon in a Cyrene team due to Cyrene ignoring part of Phainon's E6's value and making the best use out of the higher base speed from his S5. However, I want to reiterate that this is only the case in a Cyrene team. If you ever play Phainon outside of a Cyrene team, the extra core flames from Phainon's E6 suddenly become relevant again and allows you to flex him between so many different characters and teams, depending on which supports your other teams need, while still being very high in damage. So when it comes to E6 Phainon versus S5 Phainon, and which one is the higher priority when upgrading your E2 S1 Phainon, here is what I would conclude. E2 S5 Phainon is the better full investment Phainon if you will always be playing him with Cyrene, especially E2 Cyrene, since E2 Cyrene is obviously the priority before superimposing Phainon's Light Cone. Not only will S5 Phainon perform better than E6 Phainon in this team, but Phainon's Light Cone banner is an incredibly valuable banner due to the existence of the Dance 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 4-star Light Cone on the banner. On top of all of this, the Light Cone banner is much more forgiving than the character banner due to having a 75-25 pity system instead of a 50-50 system, and the pity on the Light Cone banner requires 10 fewer pulls compared to the character banner. So S5 Phainon is literally just a cheaper and stronger option than his E6. However, if you are ever separating Phainon from Cyrene because of how powerful Cyrene is in other teams, Phainon's E6 will come in super clutch for flexibility and letting him use whichever supports you want. That is the main benefit of Phainon's E6. Flexibility while also not being that much weaker than his S5. In the end, it's up to you to decide how much you value the flexibility of Phainon's E6 versus the cheaper but more restrictive upgrade of his S5. If you are hardly ever going to play Phainon with Cyrene, then his E6 is almost certainly going to be better. But if you're willing to commit to the theoretically strongest Phainon team by keeping Cyrene tied to Phainon, then his S5 will outperform. It's all a matter of how you plan on crafting your teams if you're planning to take Phainon to these ultra high investment levels. But of course, there is never any need to invest so highly into Phainon. I just wanted to put this segment here for those of you who were interested in it. The part that matters much more to most people will be the support and team investment, which we already covered with the Sparkle versus Cyrene investment plans. The last thing I want to touch on is how Phainon's build has changed. Okay, at the time this video is released, the build hasn't necessarily changed yet, but Phainon's build is on the cusp of getting an upgrade via the new Relic Set releasing alongside Mortonak's Blade. Now hold on, before you panic about needing to re-gear your Phainon, just hear me out for a bit. The new Navigator Relic Set gives 12% attack on its 2-piece, and it gives 18% damage bonus every time the wearer uses their skill, stacking up to 3 times for a total of 54% damage bonus. There are some terms and conditions to this massive damage bonus buff, but Phainon will essentially never run out of this while inside of his ultimate due to Phainon's turns in his ultimate not actually counting as real turns, and therefore he does not cause the Relic Set's buff to wear off despite how the Relic Set is worded. Now, Phainon does need to ramp up this buff inside of his ultimate, but it's generally pretty trivial, especially with Ceridra's double meteors taken into account. Sure, the first meteor or two will be weaker since this Relic Set isn't fully ramped up yet, but it can oftentimes be worth it. Let's compare it to his current best Relic Set though, the one tailor-made for Phainon that was released alongside him, Wavestrider. The Wavestrider Relic Set gives 16% crit damage on its 2-piece, which is roughly equal to the 12% attack from the Navigator set. It then gives 48% attack on the 4-piece, compared to the 54% attack from the Navigator set. These stats are all very similar, but the Navigator set ends up slightly winning out due to the sheer amount of attack Phainon is already able to get, making the 48% attack from Wavestrider not as noticeable for him. Don't get me wrong, Phainon is capable of getting a decent amount of damage percent too, but Navigator just still ends up winning out, by a little bit. If we compare the damage of his meteors when I tested both sets, Phainon with Wavestrider was hitting around 1.7 million with his meteors, while the Navigator set brought it up to 1.8 million. This is roughly a 5 to 6% increase in damage. Now, is it worth farming for a 5 to 6% increase in damage? Well, that's something only you can answer. You will need to farm a Navigator set that is as good as your current Wavestrider pieces in order to see this upgrade. All things considered, it is a pretty minuscule upgrade, but we've all experienced the pain of leaving a boss at 1% HP and needing to waste an extra turn. So, your mileage may vary on how much you value a 5% upgrade for your Phainon. Obviously, it's not mandatory by any means, but for those who were wondering, the answer is yes, the Navigator set is technically an upgrade for Phainon, but not a massive upgrade. So refarm your Phainon relics at your own leisure. This relic set will be in the same cavern as Mortonak's Blade's relic set, so if you're pulling for Blade anyway, you might as well see if you get any good pieces for Phainon. And if not, Wavestrider is still more than serviceable, so don't stress about it too hard. And yeah, wow, that was a lot to say about Phainon and everything that has changed for him since his last rerun and all the things I would consider when it comes to his upcoming rerun banner. Phainon is still a very good character who performs very well at proper investment, but the entry to playing Phainon can be a bit high since his E2 is sort of mandatory for him to feel like he was worth your pulls. Once you get that E2 E2, however, your Phainon will definitely start to carry his own weight on your account. If you aren't willing to invest that far, then like I stated earlier in the video, Phainon might not be the character for you, and you would probably be better off investing into a different team. I will also state that part of Phainon's appeal is that the entry to playing Phainon in sustainless teams, so without a healer or shielder, is much easier compared to other teams. So it's easier to maximize his damage. If you do find yourself playing Phainon with a sustain, his damage will fall off by a bit, unless your Dan Heng PT is vertically invested with Eidolons, so just be aware of that. If you hate the idea of playing a sustainless team no matter what, even if Phainon makes it easier, then once again, I would probably skip Phainon. There is just a lot to consider when it comes to investing in Phainon, and which way you want to invest into his teams. So I hope this video helped illustrate it a bit more clearly for you, so that you can decide how you want to spend your pulls to make the most out of our resident protagonist of Amphorius. Considering Cyrene's rerun will be coming up alongside Phainon's, I'll have a video dedicated to Cyrene, as well as another video that I've been meaning to make to help people make the most out of E2 Cyrene with Phainon, since there are some rotational stuff that I don't see many people make use of with E2 Cyrene in a Phainon team involving Eagle Set and DDD shenanigans. So be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on that, and like this video if you found it helpful or enjoyable at all. Comment down below if you're looking to invest further into Phainon, and if you have any further questions that weren't answered in this video, ask away, and I'll do my best to answer. Thank you so much for watching. I cannot wait to see what the future has in store for Phainon, and I have many high hopes. But for the time being, until next time!